Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at Triathletics. Today we're going to answer another question from you guys. This one is all about grip strength. So let's dive into this question, give you guys my thoughts on grip strength for pitchers. So the question is, how do you measure grip strength? How strong is strong enough for pitchers? And the third part of this is, would it be possible for grip strength to hurt velocity? Is there such a thing as too strong or potentially negative effects from grip training? So there's a few parts to this question. So first things first, more strength in and of itself is never inherently a bad thing, right? Like if you could just wave a magic wand and all of a sudden your grip strength doubled, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We'll get into kind of the purpose of your grip strength, the purpose of the flexor pronator mass in a second for stabilizing your elbow. But that's the first thing. Like if you could suddenly double your bench press, double your squat, like that's not inherently a bad thing. The problem is that strength doesn't occur in a vacuum. So it's not as simple as just waving a magic wand and being stronger. To get to that certain strength threshold, it requires progressively more and more extreme stimuli to create that adaptation. So there's a point of diminishing returns where, let's say you spend 2, 3, 4 years, you build your, let's just say a bench press up from 135 pounds to 250 pounds, right? Like decent bench press for a pitcher. To get to 350 pounds, like how much more work does that take to get to that point, right? It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The type of training that you would have to do, the volumes you would have to do, the type of recovery, how sore you would be throughout the week, how many years that would take. There's just a huge point of diminishing returns where it doesn't make sense to prioritize absolute strength past a certain point, just general big picture philosophy when training for strength for sports. So the type of training to create these adaptations have a sharp decline in the return on investment. How much time, how much recovery ability it takes to actually get that increased strength, and whether it actually transfers to on-field performance, injury prevention, all these things. The other main thing to realize specifically with regards to forearm training is that there is a competing recovery demand with pitching. Right, there's a benefit, right? We do want strong grip. We do want strong pronator flexor mass. However, in season, this is extremely important to be cognizant of, because you are constantly essentially obliterating your flexor every single time that you go and have to start and throw 80, 90, 100 pitches. And so your flexor is trying its best to recover in time for the next outing. And so if you're constantly beating it over the head with a ton of extra grip variations, super high volume grip training. We'll talk about this in a second. Again, that's a competing recovery demand. You're going to be less recovered in time for your next start, especially if maybe you're a pro guy on a 5-day schedule. If you have one start every 10 days and you're throwing 5 innings, right, it might be a little bit different. You might be able to get away with more grip training in season. So just being aware that there is kind of a fine line to walk here when it comes to grip strength. More is not always better because of what it takes to get there, and being able to balance that with the throwing volumes and intensities that you're encountering. Furthermore, in this picture, you'll see there's different types of grip strength. So crush grip strength, like this is something that you would measure with a traditional handheld grip tester. These are called a dynamometer. You can get this one for $30 on Amazon. It's called a Camry dynamometer. It's one we have used it, for years in the past. It works great. But that's not the only way to actually measure grip strength, nor, in my opinion, is it necessarily the most relevant for pitchers. You can also look at pinch grip. You can look at support grip. Theoretically, you can measure individual finger flexion strength independently as well. There's a lot of different ways to measure how strong your fingers, your wrists, your forearm are. So that's just one way. Let's look at how the grip actually functions in pitching specifically. So it primarily functions isometrically. And by isometrically, all I'm saying is that the wrist is not moving around a ton during the actual acceleration phase, right? The wrist is not, there's not actually this like snapping action of the wrist into ball release. I know a lot of you probably in the past had some coach who had you do like wrist flick drills, warming up, saying that like all the velocity comes from the wrist, it's flick. If you actually look in slow-mo at the position that you're in as the ball actually accelerates, it's going to be slight wrist extension. You're holding onto the ball, so there's slight wrist extension so that the ball is actually right in line with your forearm. So slight wrist extension, holding that through layback as the arm spirals out and around into ball release. And then again, still isometric, and then the forearm turns over. But there's not a ton of wrist movement happening during the actual acceleration phase, and that's when the flexor pronator is most active. So isometrically, the purpose is to stabilize the UCL. So it's one of the main restraints to this valgus force, this force that is literally gapping and opening up the medial elbow as you go into that aggressive layback position. So this is one of the reasons that fatigue and or weakness are large risk factors for medial elbow injury. If you're constantly throwing through fatigue, now your forearm muscles aren't able to do their job. Now the passive restraints, the ligaments, your UCL becomes that kind of second line of defense that's stabilizing the medial elbow against this valgus force. And so that's when a lot of these UCL injuries happen, is guys who throw through fatigue on a regular basis, or, which we'll talk about in a second, guys who throw relatively hard and high volumes and high workloads, but have particularly weak forearm flexor. So maybe they're fresh, but their fresh just simply still isn't very strong to be able to actually stabilize the elbow. So somebody with really, really weak grip strength who throws 95, 90 plus miles an hour with high workloads, or someone maybe they do have a strong grip strength, they do have a strong, healthy flexor, but they're constantly just beating themselves up, 100 pitches, 120 pitches, 130 pitches, pitching on short rest, and so they're still essentially functioning with a weak flexor because it's functioning in a fatigued, not fully recovered state. So we need to be able to stabilize the UCL, have a healthy, strong flexor. How is that force being applied to the ball? It's being applied through the fingers. So for a fastball, and in general for most pitches, obviously the changeup's a little bit different, but it's going to primarily be applied through that index finger and middle finger. So that's really your contact point to the ball, which is important when looking at some of the muscles that actually stabilize the medial elbow. The ones that actually run from the fingers all the way to the medial elbow are particularly important in varying degrees of pronation and supination. So depending on where you are in layback, you're going to be in a little bit more of a supinated position back here, a little bit more of a pronated position near ball release. After ball release, obviously turning over into more pronation, internal rotation. But depending on the actual pitch you're throwing, you're going to be in more supination with any sort of breaking pitch. You're going to be holding supination longer, especially on maybe a sweeper, slider, a curveball, and you're going to be holding a little bit less supination, getting to more of a pronated position on something like a changeup. So recognizing that there is some variation there, and given that different flexor muscles, different forearm muscles are going to have different contributions based on the positioning. So this is something that isn't talked about a ton, but you have, really there's three main muscles that are probably most relevant when it comes to pitching and forearm strength and elbow health. These are going to have different contributions depending on what pitch you're throwing. It's not something that's been studied extensively that I'm aware of. But the key point to know here is that just looking at the actual torque, you might be able to say fastball and curveball have similar joint torques. But that doesn't actually necessarily mean that the different muscles are all having the exact same contribution depending on what pitch you're throwing, right? So anecdotal evidence here, but in general, guys who throw a lot of breaking balls are going to have more soreness in the pronator. Why? Because they're throwing in more supination. They're here at release. They're again, for my arm slider, maybe they're out here. They're in a more supinated position at release, and so their pronator is on more of a full stretch in that position. Me personally, when I start throwing breaking balls after an on-ramp, the first thing that starts getting sore and tired, and I can feel it while I'm throwing, is my pronator teres. I start to feel a little bit of a stretch there at ball release, and that's where I start getting sore. So the demand will shift on your forearm depending on what type of pitch you're throwing. And again, just worth pointing that out. Pronator teres, flexor carpi ulnaris, which is on kind of the medial side. That's something, if you were going to do kind of like a curveball position here, that's really the medial side, and the flexor digitorum superficialis, again, running from your fingers all the way to your medial elbow. That's another important one here. So we already talked about Crushing grip strength, it's easy to measure with a handheld dynamometer. However, it's probably not the most relevant from what we know now and what we've learned to pitching. However, it can still give us a very general approximation. So you asked kind of what is the, what do we generally look for on that? In our experience, if we can get somewhere over about 150 pounds, at least with this dynamometer, which is one of the more common kind of budget dynamometers, to us, that's the goal for a hard-throwing college or professional pitcher. If it's a pitcher who's throwing particularly hard, but their grip strength is ranking very, very low, to us, that's a red flag because they're putting a lot of horsepower through their body, but they don't necessarily have the strength to actually stabilize it. So under 120 pounds for us has kind of ranked in the bottom percentile. Over 150 pounds tends to be kind of out of that red flag zone, and somewhere in between those are kind of average numbers, just as a guide. Those numbers will vary depending on the type of dynamometer that you have. Some will have slightly higher or lower readings, but in general, you're going to want to be kind of in that upper 75th plus percentile for pitchers your age group as a general goal. It's worth noting this doesn't give us finger isometric strength, which again, to me, is probably one of the more relevant things to know. We haven't come across anything yet that we've been able to implement, especially remotely with our athletes. But again, for us, the force that you can actually input isometrically through those first index and middle finger in a little bit of wrist extension, to us, that's probably the most relevant number that we would want to know, because that's the position that you're holding as your arm spirals out and around into layback and ultimately into ball release. So again, something that we're kind of keeping an eye on, and probably going to find a way to add that into our in-person assessment as well. So here's a routine, which we'll talk about that in a second, but a sample kind of like isometric post-throwing routine that you could do. And again, you'll see emphasis on isometrics. This would be kind of a flexor digitorum hold, again, through those first two fingers, a little bit of wrist extension, pushing down into a table, a bench, whatever you've got. Resisted flexion, inner range. So again, in a kind of full wrist flexion position. Challenging the pronator teres. So taking yourself into a full supination. This would be really good for anybody who kind of like myself, a little bit limited in supination range of motion, and do feel a stretch in your pronator when you try to throw any sort of breaking ball. This is one that's both strengthening and stretching. This would be pronation, but in training the pronator in full shortened position. And then we talk about the flexor carpi ulnaris, that inner part of your forearm. Again, training that in both the inner and outer parts of the range of motion. So just an isometric routine, a couple sets of 30-second holds, each of these using a baseball bat, Indian club shown here, anything like that. That's one that we will often prescribe for our athletes from a health standpoint. And then again, the Arm Care app, if you haven't heard of the Arm Care app, we put a review on our website where we tested this, broke it down. Would highly recommend looking into that. They send you a handheld force tester. It's called a dynamometer. There's a picture up here showing how you can test your shoulder strength with it, but they actually have a way to test your grip strength with a pinching grip strength test as well with it. So a little bit more specific, again, working on including the finger flexors and the flexor digitorum into that number. And so again, they add that into kind of a composite score to where you can see kind of your risk level and your fatigue level over the course of the season. I will link our review of the Arm Care app in the description so you guys can go and check that out. Another consideration, especially in season, is overdoing grip work. So there's a high risk of fatigue in season. Again, these are competing for recovery. So you go and you blow up your forearm flexors, throwing a ton of pitches. If you overdo what you're doing in the weight room as well, or overdo the strengthening side of it, this actually is going to hurt velocity more than it's going to help, because you're just digging yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into a recovery deficit. This will increase injury risk in the short term if it's not timed properly. So you don't want to be necessarily doing a ton of high volume deadlifts or fat grip chin-ups or farmer's walk competitions with your friends like the day before a bullpen. I've heard stories of Division I strength coaches having entire pitching staffs doing farmer's walk competitions before game day, and then a couple guys go out the next day and get hurt. right? We need to be smart about this, realize that the flexor needs to be fully recovered, flexor pronator mass, which again includes the 3 muscles I already talked about primarily. Those need to be maximally recovered. We can get them strong in the off season, maintain that in season, and then again just pepper in some different isometric strengthening in a kind of responsible way. We like doing that in the post throwing routine, game day or after a bullpen. So 2 times a week, maybe 3 times a week. But again, keeping the volume down, trying to avoid anything that would create undue soreness or dig yourself into a recovery deficit. Also important to just kind of recognize on top of the strength side, on top of the fatigue side, and just monitoring that, like, is the tissue quality taken care of as well? I shared this picture a couple of Q&As before, but this is a lefty pitcher who had lost a ton of supination over the course of the season, over the course of his career. So you can see he's, I think, about almost 45 degrees off here from what his full supination on his right arm was. So in this case, you'd really want to be cautiously adding in some different end range isometric and strengthening / mobility type work to work on just addressing if there's a tissue tone issue as well here at play. To go along with that, flexor dominance is a real thing where the athlete has a hard time actually getting into. So one of our assessments looks at wrist extension with a straight arm, and some guys will have a problem actually getting their wrist up. They'll get stuck right here, and so they don't actually have the ability to get that full wrist extension as well. And so part of that is, if the flexor is super toned up and tight, but part of that is also the extensors need to be strong as well. So if all you do is all this forearm curls and flexor type work, but you never do anything to actually work on the opposite side of the joint, the extension side of the joint, then that creates an imbalance in the joint as well. So making sure to still do some, maybe it's like reverse forearm curls, extension type work, isometric activations, just being aware that we address the opposite side of the joint too. It's not just doing all flexion based work, because again, that can create an imbalance in the joint. So hopefully that answered your question. That's all I got today. Drop your questions below and I will get to those in a future video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this content. If you have any questions, shoot us an email, contact@treadathletics.com. I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.